Everyone happy with object relational mappers? Some use SQL, which means you'll have to do a lot of work. Some will use an SQL-like language and do everything on your behalf, and they tend to be the frameworks like the entity framework. Okay? And they all have one thing in common. They map your database tables into objects of a different object-oriented language. Is everyone cool with that? Okay? So, that's the summary here. There's our relational tables in our database. Whoops. Okay. So our database here, they get mapped to a model, which is just some C# or Java classes. Those models define a class with the properties that match the columns in your table. Okay. There it is declared here. That can be auto-generated by an object relational mapper. Okay, and then some mappers will further go on to provide interfaces to interact with your database. Okay, Dapper won't. Dapper stops at this point here. Okay, whereas the entity framework will take you to this point here and do everything for you. Okay, and it'll also allow you to directly access the database using LINQ and Lambda expressions if you want to do custom queries. Is everyone cool with that? Okay, so we've done that. I think everyone's happy with that. So, why would we want to do this? There's a few more slides about this. Well, some queries can be difficult, okay? Certainly when you're doing aggregates, okay, like in the assignment, the second assignment, okay? If I had to write that using SQL, it would take me a lot longer than what it would have had I done it using LINQ queries, okay? So you guys are getting JSON strings, and the JSON objects being returned were power outages for each year. And inside the years, there was months and all sorts of other stuff, okay? I did all of that with LINQ a lot easier than what I would have done with SQL, okay? So, some queries can be difficult, but when we change it to LINQ, we can simplify them a little bit, okay? Also, relational databases have simplistic data types. There is a thing here. Does anyone remember, if we go back to relational databases from last year, okay, remember, when you write a store procedure or a view, okay, they get cached on the server. And what does caching do? Does anyone remember? If you run a query for the first time, is it faster or slower than the second time? Sorry? When you run a query for the first time, is it faster or slower? Slower, okay? Then it caches it, okay? And it's slower because it has to inspect the indexes, come up with a few different ways of doing the query. It chooses the fastest one and then caches it, okay? The next time you run the same query, it's already cached the best way of doing it, so it just grabs that and does it that way, okay? You can imagine if you have an object relational mapper that's got dynamic queries in it like our for each loop on our where clause, and every time someone types in a different term, the number of terms in the text box is going to be carved up differently and whatever. That can't be cached, okay? So sometimes an object relational mapper will be slower than doing things in straight SQL, because if you call a store procedure, it's already cached. But if you're creating a query on the fly, it can't be cached. Does that make sense? Okay? So there are some pros and cons about it. But it's not necessarily about that, it's about making things easier to do. Okay? So that's a limitation. Queries cannot be cached if they're being dynamically generated all the time. But we're doing it because it's easier to use, not necessarily the best thing to use. Okay? So on large scale systems, ORM mappers will slow things down, but then you've got to weigh up paying someone to write SQL queries and interacting with the SQL database versus paying programmers who still have to build a website who can then program using an object relational mapper to talk to the database. Okay, that's cheaper than paying an Oracle developer to do things with the database. Okay, but that's probably the main drawback. Okay, so ORM is a little bit slower, but in terms of ease of use and programming, it's a bit cheaper to use. Okay, there's another reason why we want to use these. And it's because it allows us to implement design patterns when we're designing our websites. Okay, have you guys done much in design patterns so far? No? Okay. So a design pattern is just a simple way, a way of structuring your code. Okay, and that's it. And the reason why we do it is that people have learned from their errors in the past, and they say, okay, well, when you're doing this task, if you group your code into this approach, it's almost guaranteed to work, okay? It simplifies debugging and problems in the future, okay? So a design pattern is a simple way of structuring code in a program to try and avoid issues in the future, okay? It's used to separate responsibilities and simplify code. And, well, there's two main ones that you guys are going to use. There's model view controller that you'll do when you do user interfaces. And then there's model view model, which is what we use for C# web forms and also